I met Baba in 52, 56, 58, and 62. And I did not get to go to the men's Sahavas of 54, but that's a whole story, another story. And it's been my experience that even though I've told it a few hundred times, that most people seem to be the most interested in how one comes to Baba. And in my case, well, their curiosity is justified because I'm the most unlikely candidate I can think of. Because I was born on a dirt farm in Texas 5 or 6 years ago. There was not, and that is actually the Bible Belt, which I hope is disappearing, but not fast enough. My father broke a line of Methodist preachers, if you're ready. He had, I think, 5 or 6 generations before him. And I remember as a child, we had revival meetings, which are, now that's a circus if you haven't seen it. But my mother used to play piano for the revival meetings, and I was the youngest child, and I had to sit in the front pew all by myself because nobody else sat there, and so she could keep an eye on me. And you know, these ranting and raving preachers. But anyway, that was my spiritual background. And it happened, then we moved to the city, and when I was around 8, I don't know exactly what prompted it, but I came home one day and announced to my parents that I was not going to go to church anymore. And they said, oh? And why not? And I don't remember exactly what I said, but I have an impression that somehow or other the hypocrisy of the church did not appeal to me. And my father, a wonderful, gentle man, said, well, all right, you don't have to go to church, but don't get any smart ideas on how you behave. So, okay. So I grew up a misfit. I won't say outcast, but a misfit in my society because somewhere along the line, and this is really, I mean, I don't usually say this kind of thing, but I tell this because I really think that this was Baba's finger from the very beginning. Somewhere along the line, I decided I wanted to be a dancer. If you can picture a farmer, or, you know, by that time I had a newspaper route and so forth and so. And not only that, I wanted to be a ballet dancer. Well, I had never seen ballet, so I do not know where that came from. But there were a couple of books in the local library. We may have had 50 or 60 altogether. And somewhere along the line I learned, well, you had to be very young to start ballet, to be a ballet dancer. And by this time I was a teenager and realized, well, that wasn't very practical. So I thought, well, I'll be an actor. Anything to get away from Canyon, Texas. And it was something like that. Not that my childhood was brutal or unhappy or any, more than the one difficulty or another that everybody goes through, but I just wanted to get away from there and in a wider world. And so when I graduated from high school, the summer that I graduated from high school, I met a woman from Albany, New York, who had 2 daughters. And she was down in Texas to visit one of these 2 daughters. And these 2 daughters had gone into show business. And, it wasn't big time or anything like that, but it was show business. Well, I was enthralled and gaga. And I confided in her my secret passion that I wanted to be a dancer. And that I knew I never could be, and so forth and so on. That's what I really wanted. She said, well, I've heard about this place up in the Berkshires, in Massachusetts, and it's a summer festival, and they have a school. And it's quite famous, as indeed it really was. It was Jacob's Pillow. And in the dance world, Jacob's Pillow is a very well-known name. I mean, it's a household name. Ted Shawn founded it up in the Berkshires, and Ruth St. Dennis was up there, and so forth and so on. So anyway, she said, when I go back, I'll get some information about it, and I'll send it to you. So she did. And it turned out that they offered, in very fine print, a few scholarships are available. And since I had no money, I decided, I wrote to them, and I told them that I didn't know, I had no training, and did not know that I had talent, but I was willing to work. And that more than anything in the world, I wanted to come to Jacob's Pillow to study dancing. Well, lo and behold, I got that scholarship. So that's not Baba's hand. And so I went. And boy, I said I was willing to work. Well, I really did, because there were 4 scholarships boys, and 3 of them were already dancers. And I mean, I grew up on a farm and in a cleaning shop and so forth. I really did know how to work. And I thought that's what everybody did, but that's not true. And certainly if you don't feel that you should work, and they didn't, I was doing everybody's work. But that's perfectly all right. I feel you pay your way one way or the other. And as it happened, that particular summer, Valley Theater, it is now called American Valley Theater, but it was just Valley Theater in there, was in residence. Part of the company was in residence up there at Jacob's Pillow. And their new ballet mistress from England was coming to Jacob's Pillow to teach. Now, this ballet mistress' name was Margaret Craske. And Miss Craske had come, this was 1947. Miss Craske had come from India, I believe, in December. She came to England in December of 1946. Now, you historians, you are free to correct me. I may give you an argument, but you're still free to correct. She came in December of 1946, and I met her in June of 1947. So she was rather fresh from Baba. Well, what can I tell you? I fell madly and hopelessly in love with this lady. I mean, some of you who have met her, well, that will be hard to understand. But you don't, I doubt if any of you really know what a hick is. They've disappeared. But back then, mind you, I grew up in the 30s, and there was no television, there was no, and we didn't have a radio, and I didn't see a movie, I think, until I was about 12. And so, I mean, I really was a hick. And here is this refined culture, magical, witty English lady. And boy, if that doesn't trick you, nothing will. And she was actually my first ballet teacher. So I was pretty much in luck. And that summer, the news went around that this woman was weird, that maybe she was yogi, she used to sit up on a mountain and pull dolls through her nose or whatever they did. And yet, well, I didn't care what anybody said about her. But anyway, it turned out that a few people did inquire about Baba. One of them is Ella Marks, who was Ella Massey then. Some of you may know her. And I still am friends with Ella, whom I met there that summer in 1947. And it's very strange that Ella and I met Miss Craske in 1947 and became interested in Baba. And we were the 2 that were with her when she died, which was purely coincidental. And yet there were 2 other dancers, Ed Henkel and Sylvia Nolan, and they came down when Miss Craske was very ill. And there was Ed and Sylvia and Ella and me. And someone else, Catherine Horn, said, oh, the youngest and the oldest. And it turned out that they were her contemporary pupils, and we were the old ones. But anyway, so okay. Well, that summer ended. Some people did ask about Baba. And I believe Ella was one of them. And that summer ended, and Miss Craske went to a tour with Ballet Theater, and I was offered a scholarship by another teacher in New York City, and I broke my parents' heart for the first time really badly when I announced to them that I was not going to college, because they came from very humble backgrounds and had slaved their entire lives, and their one goal in life was to have their children graduate from college, and I had a scholarship, and I turned it down. And what's the matter? Oh, because I'm coughing and hacking? Oh, well, you know, it's a life of sin, what kind of thing. Okay, but anyway, so I guess maybe this will help. Gin would be better. But anyway, so I went to study in New York, and what's the matter now?
The dish was under your foot, water in the lake.
Thank you.
Because people like that.
Oh, okay. So Miss Craske would come into the city when the company would come in, and those of us from the Pillow who had gone to New York, Ella and Rosemary and all these people, we would call her up. She stayed at the Woodward Hotel, I remember so well, and she would have lunch with us or dinner with us, which, looking back on it, was so amazing. I mean, we must have been the bores of the world, and yet there she was. Because I learned out much later that Baba, when Miss Craske, who did not really enjoy being in India at all, those whole 7 years, she loved Baba and she wanted to be with Baba, but she didn't want to be in India, which to me is the easiest thing in the world to understand. But anyway, when she left India, Baba told her, said, go out into the world and teach dancing and spread my word. And that's what she did. And she tolerated one idiot after another for years and years and years. And she taught until she was 93.
Oh, wow.
And even then, everybody had to put pressure on her to make her stop. I mean, her health was failing and so forth, and lots of disastrous things. And finally, she did give it up. But she obeyed Baba implicitly. All the way. So, okay, time passed, and I got a job at the Metropolitan Opera. And she was, by that time, an associate director at the School of the Met. And all these years, from 1947, it was now getting along to be around 1952, and I had been to dinner with her and luncheon with her, and I adored her more and more and more all the time. I mean, mind you, I was completely intimidated by her, and people always laugh because I still go through the day I would call her Miss Craske. I have no trouble calling Elizabeth Elizabeth and Kitty Kitty and Dee, but never, I will never have the nerve to call her Margaret. And because I was her pupil. And so all these years that I had been going out to lunch and dinner with her, and we became friends as well. And I had heard these stories about Baba. I mean, I remember that Ella Marks and I were on the street one day, and it was right across the street from Carnegie Hall, and we met Miss Craske on the corner. And she greeted us and everything like that, and she looked at Ella and she said, which was news to me, she said, when are you going to come to me and talk to me about Baba again? And Ella, who was courtesy itself, well, Miss Craske, Isn't that good? And so Miss Craske sort of chuckled, and she looked at me and said, you know, Ella doesn't quite know what to make of Baba. She changed, and he said, what do you make of him? Well, she could. I couldn't have been more shocked if she had slapped me. And I went, and she laughed, and she said, well, you better come and speak to me. Well, that was, if I could have chosen the 10 most unsavory things in my life I wouldn't want to do, that would be at the top of the list. Anyway, that was very, very difficult for me, painful. I worked up, and yet I respected her and loved her so much that I felt that if she asked me that I had to go, well, I went through torture because I didn't want anything to do with that kind of thing, somehow or other. And yet I went, and she was charm itself. She could charm the skin off a snake without even trying. Ah, she smiled at you. And she told me stories of Baba. She told me, the only thing I know about Baba and the philosophy and so forth and so on, I learned through the stories that Miss Craske told me. To this day, I mean, when I went to her, I mean, being a very superior intellect, I said, well, what have you got to read? And she said, oh no, my lad, you're in enough of a muddle as it is. You're not going to get anything to read. And so she wouldn't let me read for about 7 years. And at the end of 7 years, she said, oh, you're always asking for something to read. So she went into one of her drawers and she fumbled around, and she came out with a little thing about this big. And it had 7 pages, and it was the 7 basic realities. And she said, that should hold you for this lifetime. And so it is. And to this day, and she gave me murder mysteries to read, because that's what Papa gave her. And to this day, I cannot read. I mean, I've tried to get through God's speech. I've really tried. No way. I read 10 pages and I stop and I say, what have I read? Not one word. Not one word. That happens to me time and again. But there was, I went far enough at one point that, I don't know, page 269 or something like that, where he says, I am only writing this to still the convulsions of your mind. And I figured, well, it's not so bad after all. If I can. So there we go. But anyway, came 1952, and I had been seduced by Miss Craske. And then Baba was coming to America. And all of a sudden, boy, I dug in my heel. Now, wait a minute. I mean, all these marvelous stories she told me, I thought, you know, that was ancient history. And colorful and amusing and interesting and beautiful they were. But I thought that was all over and done with. And so then he's coming to America. Well, I go through the whole thing over again, worse, that I did not want to come. Boy, did I not want to come. But, okay, my love and respect for Miss Craske once again came to the fore. That I felt that even though I had no feeling at all of which I was aware in any way, I said, you have to go. I mean, what kind of a slob are you? And I didn't want the answer to that. So I decided, well, I will. And by that time, there were 3 young women, Zebra and Sura and Skipper, who were also in the Met at the time, dancers, and they had become interested in Baba. And as it would happen, we would be on tour with the Met when Baba was seeing people at Myrtle Beach on which day, don't ask me, I'm a terrible historian, but on one particular day, we were free to see him. He was meeting people for the first time. Now, on that particular day, which I will say was a Saturday. I don't know, I think it was, but don't get upset. And don't write it down. Because, okay? And we would be in Minneapolis. And there was a contractual agreement at that time that if you were on tour with a company, you were not free to go beyond a radius of 50 miles of wherever the company was playing. Well, the Myrtle Beach was more than 50 miles. So the only thing to do was to get permission to go. But before we got permission, we had to do this all sort of in a rush deal. And Bunty Kelly, who was not in the Met at that time, was our liaison in New York, and she was doing research as to, how to get to. Now, Myrtle Beach in those days was a far cry from what it is now. First of all, it was very beautiful. I mean, between Myrtle Beach proper and the center, there was nothing but open land, beautiful. I mean, and Myrtle Beach did not have an airport, and there was no way to get there. That's all. The only way we could possibly go was to hire a plane. Now, you've got 4 gypsies, 4 dancers, who, we didn't make all that money, much money, certainly, and we never did. But for us to hire a plane was quite an endeavor, quite an undertaking. But we managed to do that. We hired some company out of Chicago who hired out private planes. And we had to put down a deposit of $800, which was a fortune to us in those days. I mean, not so little now to me, but it was like worth 5 or 6 times that. And it was unredeemable. You couldn't get it back. So we did that because that took time, and so we covered ourselves there that we'd put down that money and we would have this plane reserved for that particular day. Then we had to go through getting permission to leave the company long enough to go see Baba. Well, I knew that Miss Craske would want us to do it in a proper way. Therefore, we could not go, we didn't dare go over anybody's head. We had to go through, I mean, the Metropolitan Opera Company on tour was a pretty big organization. So that we went to our immediate superior, which was our choreographer and ballet director, and asked and told him, and he knew Miss Craske, and he even knew about Baba. But he said, well, you can't go. I'm not taking that on, you can't go. And so and then we decided, well, we would go to the assistant stage manager. Well, we went away, we didn't even finish the sentence. He said, get out of here, you can't go. And so then we went to the production stage manager, and then to the tour manager, and finally we got to the assistant general manager, and everybody said without qualification, no, you cannot go. So the only one left was a man named Rudolph Bing, who at that time was almost a household name. He was an extremely famous man who had directed the Glyndebourne Festival and was now a general director of the Metropolitan Opera. Well, we were frantic. We didn't really know what we were going to do. And then came a particular Sunday, and we were in Minneapolis already, and for some reason or other, the girls decided they wanted to get dressed up. You know, when you're on tour, you're in blue jeans and this and that and the other for months on end and so forth. And they decided they wanted to be, fetching. So the company kept our wardrobe trunks. We carried our hand luggage and the company carried our wardrobe. So we went to the theater. It was a matinee with Traviata that afternoon. So I didn't have anything, but they decided they wanted to get dressed up. And mind you, these were 3 lookers. Zebra looked a lot like Mehera. She didn't have a beautiful heart-shaped face as Mehera did, but she was dark and she parted her hair and she was very beautiful. And Sura was a tall, kind of Greek, statuesque blonde, with beautiful high cheekbones. And Skipper was had gorgeous skin. She grew up in Seattle. She never saw the sun. So this beautiful soft skin and red hair. And so there was the brunette, the blonde, and the redhead. And they all got gussied up, and believe me, they looked pretty good. And there I was. I mean, I did my best. Anyway, I was with them, and we came around a corner, and whom do we meet face to face but Rudolph Bing with the entire entourage. The assistant manager, the tour manager, right down to the choreographer. And I don't know where this came from, but I walked straight up to him and I said, Mr. Bean, could we ask you a favor? And he said, yes. And he had the strong Austrian accent and looked down his nose at me. And I told him, I don't remember what I said, but I told him why we wanted to go. And he said, is this very important to you? And I said, I don't know where this came from. I said, it's the most important thing in my life. But I said, and so this lascivious eye went over the blonde. And he said, of course you must go. Well, the choreographer fell did that. But we had permission with witnesses to go. So, okay. Time came, that day came. Oh, well, like we no more than achieved that, monumental task, then Baba sent word that you can't come on Saturday, you have to come on Friday. Oh. Well, I knew perfectly well that there was no way that we could go to Rudolph Bing and ask him to change that. I mean, I did not know how practical Baba was at that time, and Baba was. If anything, he was practical. But I believe that he would have agreed that you just can't push your luck that far. So I got in touch with Miss Craske somehow or other. Baba was already here, and she was with him. I don't remember all the details. It was 50-something years ago, 50 years ago. But anyway, she said, well, I'll see what I can do. So anyway, she did, and she got in touch with me, and she said, Baba said, yes, he will see you on Saturday as originally planned, but you must be there before 5 in the afternoon. Okay. So, we thought, well, I thought, oh, that's great, because, we have this plane hired, and we're going to go to Myrtle Beach, and we're going to see Baba and come back on the same day, right? And meet the company, which was moving from Minneapolis to Bloomington, Indiana, while we were gone, because we didn't have a performance that day. Had we had a performance, we'd never been able to go. So we, no problem, right? Well, the day dawned, I guess, I would never know it, because we got up at like 4 in the morning, and my task was that I was going to get a cab, and we were at the University of Minnesota, and billeted in different places, different dorms, and I was going to get a cab and go and pick up each of the girls. Well, I walked out and couldn't believe my eyes. There was a fog, like you could hardly see your hand in front of your face. Like you just wouldn't believe. And I thought, how did you get a cab? And I went trudging through the snow, because it was, after all, Minnesota, and it was only May. So, don't you know, a cab came along. And he said, where are you going? And I told him, well, we're going to such and such a private airport. And he's, and drove off. And, but another cab came. And I asked him, and, where are you going? And I said, well, we're going. And he said, well, you're not going anywhere. And I said, will you take us to the airport? And he said, well, why not? I'm not going to get any other fares anyway. So he did. And the way we got to the airport was for me to stick my head out the window and look at the shoulder of the plane and see where the lights hit and tell him to the left of it. And we crawled to that little airport. And we got to the airport, and sure enough, there was a man in attendance in a little hut, and he was absolutely shocked to see us. And he said, "We don't expect to go anywhere, do you?" And I said, "Well, we said we're going to try." And he said, "Well, you know, sit down and make us." And he gave coffee and so forth and so on. And we waited and we waited and we waited for our plane to arrive. And finally, Skipper and I decided we would take a little stroll in the fresh air. Thick, you know, take a drink, so. Anyway, we're walking around and all of a sudden, Skipper stopped dead cold. I look at her and I say, "What's that?" And she was saying, and she's staring into this. And this man materialized out of the mist. That man was our pilot. He had landed that plane, and I hadn't heard it. And in those days I could hear. I mean, I didn't. But anyway, then he announced to us, he said, "You know, I came because, you know, you have your money down." We had paid our full, you know, I forgot how much it was, but it was more than $800. And he said, "I came because I can fly on instruments if I fly by myself. So I came up here on instruments, but if I have passengers, the law says I cannot fly on instruments. I have to go by visual navigation." Isn't that fun? Well, anyway, he said, "Do you want to try?" And we said, "Yeah." So we got to Chicago, hours and hours and hours late already. So I said, "Well, I'd better send a telegram." Now, mind you, the only information I had about the center in those days was a post office box number. I didn't know if they had telephones in South Carolina. Anyway, I sent a telegram to that, and I said, "We are delayed because of poor weather." Something to that effect. And because they were expecting us at something like 11 o'clock in the morning. And, okay, so this man who was named Warren E. By, I don't think I'll ever forget that name, because he came to Chicago. We got to Chicago, and he came out with a rather grim face, and he said, "They don't want us to take off." And this was a man, I decided that he just didn't like to hear, "You can't do that." "You can't do that." So he said, "Shall we try?" So we took off. We flew and we flew and we flew. And what can I tell you? We landed 5 times. Circumnavigating storms. We had to land and take on new gas. And I thought it was 3 times, but when Miss Craske died, I'm taking a tangent here, but I was going through her things and I came across a letter that I had written to her in 1952, and it was right after we had met Baba. And she had kept that letter. Miss Craske was not sentimental, but she had kept that letter since 1952. And in it I realized that, well, we had landed 5 times. Anyway, and the last time, but the 4th time we landed, we were landing in Louisville, and the weather just, it was awful. You know, the rain was practically horizontal, and though there was no wind, it was just this terrible rain, and dismal weather. And every time we landed, Mr. Bai would go into the control tower and spend some time and come back and say, you know, we're having trouble, this and that and the other. And we got to the point where we didn't say anything. We would just look at him and he'd go out. And every single time he managed, some way or another, to finagle permission to take off. And we got to Louisville, and he came out with a very different look on his face. And he said, they won't let us go. Well, we didn't say anything, and then he looked at these broads, you know, his lookers, and he went back. And he came back, and he said, get in the plane. And I knew it would blow a buzz, because I knew we didn't have permission to take off. I mean, I feel we didn't. By the way, he said, well, all right, so we fly and we fly and we fly. And then he said, in the middle of this, I was in the back seat, Skipper was in the front. We used to take turns. Those of us, there were 3 people in the back seat and 2 in front with the pilot. And this plane was, I mean, it was a flying orange crate, believe me. He said, open the glove compartment and look for map number something or other. So she does, and he said, she unfolded this map, and I held one in it, and she did a huge thing. And he said, look for around H17. So I said, well, here's H, and she said, well, here's 17. So we looked, and he said, have you got that? And she said, yes. And he said, now you look for something or other, and I forgot about it. He said, and she said, she looked, and she found it, and he said, is that to the right or to the left of something? And she said, well, it's to the left. And in the midst, I said, we're lost. And we were. But he found out, with this and that and the other, and throwing that map, and he said, I'm sorry, we're out of gas. And we landed in Louisville. But by this time, it was very late in the day, and the weather was easing up, and we were allowed to take off. And I think it must have been around 5 o'clock exactly and I got to thinking, I said, we're not going to see him. We've done all this song and dance, and we're not going to see him. Because I knew that Baba kept his word about, if you're supposed to be there, I don't know why I knew that you're supposed to be there, and if you're not there, that's just your tough luck. And Mr. Bai, whom, when we were in Louisville, he said, you're not going to get there. Do you want to go on? And we said, might as well. And he said, might as well. I'm hired to take you there. And so he was. And at 5 o'clock, well, I swear, I was in the front seat this time. And all of a sudden, the clouds parted like Christ parting the Red Sea. And the whole world was bathed in this golden light, having been washed very well all day long. And I thought, it was like you could almost hear the music. And, but we were not going to be able to see Baba. It was already 5 o'clock. Well, we got to Myrtle Beach, and I think it was 8 o'clock at night. I remember it was dark, because I got out of the plane and went running to the administration building and tripped over a fence, because it was a little low fence. But anyway, we had been instructed to contact Mrs. Houston at the Lafayette Manor Hotel, that she was our contact. So I called her, and this hysterical, I said, this is Tex Hightower speaking. Well, she screamed, and she was hysterical on the other end of the line. She said, where are you? Where are you? And I said, well, we're in Myrtle Beach. And she gathered herself together. She said, well, I have a message from Mom. And I said, yes, ma'am. And she said, you're to come here, and you're to spend the night here at the hotel. And Baba will see you at 7 in the morning. Now, really and truly, I did not expect that. So, okay, well, I don't know what kind of a night I spent, but the Lafayette Manor Hotel was fantastic. It was right out of Tennessee Williams. It was a square frame building, 2 floors high, and the ceilings were like 20 feet high, and the windows went from floor to top, and a little bit, more than a little dilapidated, past beauty, and it had a veranda all the way around on both floors. It was magical. And a staircase that was obviously made for hoop skirts. It was that. But okay, and Mrs. Houston was rather charming when she gathered her beads. And so anyway, come 7 o'clock in the morning, Sarosh, that was the only time I ever met Sarosh. He came to pick us up in the car, and we drove at that time a beautiful drive from Myrtle Beach proper to the center. And then we went inside the center, and the minute we got inside the center, a strange thing happened to me. I wasn't unaware of it until later, but what happened was I became aware of silence, but silence. And I discovered that silence is not only the absence of sound, it is the presence of silence. And I didn't hear the motor, I didn't hear the birds singing, I didn't hear the gravel on the road or anything like that. And it was very odd. And of course, by this time, I'd like to remind you, I didn't want to be there in the first place. I was a little bit tense. And we got to the original kitchen. The center was a little bit different. There was this circle, and everything was around that circle. And we drove up in front of the original kitchen, and I was in the front seat, and I got out, and I came nose to breastbone with Rano, who looked down at me like, oh, the Arctic funnel, and said, "You could have sent a telegram." And I thought, "Oh, I'm not sending a telegram. What's the matter with her?" And then she sort of stalked off, and I'll tell you later what that's all about. And then I guess it was Delia came up, and she said she was taking us around to not the side entrance of the original kitchen, but the other entrance. And I heard in the middle of the room, and by the time we got to the door, Kitty met us at the door, and she said, "It doesn't matter how you take Baba, just as long as you take him." Well, first of all, Ronald had treated me like a leper, and then this woman says to me something out like that, right off the wall. Anyway, so at that time there was those of you who know the center, there's the original kitchen and then they added an addition, but there's a little bricked-in patio in between. Well, in the old days, the new kitchen wasn't there, and this just was a little bricked-in patio, and there was a little bench sitting right there, and this bench you could look and you could see the lagoon cabin. Now, your lagoon cabin had a front door that I considered the front door, which opened towards the lagoon, and a side door that opened on towards the center. Well, Delia came, and she took Zebra. We sat down, Zebra, Sura, Skipper, and me, sitting there. And it's, first of all, 7 o'clock in the morning, and I'm not a morning person anyway, but anyway, aside from that. So I watch, and Zebra goes in the front door, and I don't know how long it was, but all of a sudden she explodes out the side door in hysterical sobs. And I thought, oh. Of course, Zebra is a very emotional type. Okay. So then the statuesque blonde in the form of Sura goes in. And I'm looking rather intently by this time, and the same thing happens off, and she goes off, to her, and she goes off wandering in another direction. And then Skipper, whom I considered at the time the most sophisticated one of all of us, I don't know if she was or not, but I considered her so. It was her turn. And I looked at her there, I was going to see what happened there. Well, what can I tell you? She came staggering out the side door and walked straight into a tree. Well, by this time, the hackles on the back of my neck. And Delia came to me, and I just sat there. And she took my hand, and I just sat there. And she gave a little tug, and I thought, well, don't be rude. So I got up and I followed Delia, and we went along that little path. And when we turned the corner, the little path that led right up to the lagoon cabin, I saw something. There was a screen door, and I saw something white pass. And I knew that was Baba. And boy, I dropped my head. I didn't drop my eye. I dropped my head pressed against, and I stumbled up that path and got into the cabin, and I knew that Baba was standing there, but I didn't see him. And then a strange thing happened. This was not a mystical experience, please understand, but the best way I can describe it, it was almost a physical experience. I was standing in a mummy case of clay, all completely covered. And suddenly, this mummy case began to crack. And it cracked very slowly, and it came between my toes and my ankles and up my knees and cracked this way, and over my head and down the back. And when it got to the bottom, it fell to the side. And I stepped out of it, at which point I lifted my eyes and looked into Baba's face. And Baba opened his arms to me, and he embraced me. Mind you, I didn't know that I had any feeling for Baba. Baba embraced me with such a power of love. I mean, everything was in that embrace. It was tender and it was sweet, but it was so powerful. And I feel that he gave me enough love for about 5 or 6 lifetimes. And it was a total surprise. I didn't have any idea that love like that existed. And I looked into Baba's eyes, and Leatrice put it very well. I'll never forget, first of all, you've never seen anything that beautiful. I can promise you. I don't know what you've seen, but you've never seen anything that beautiful. His eyes were dark, dark brown. And you looked into them, and they went on and on and on and on. And 30 or 40 years later, I realized something that had been in my mind at that moment. That, mind you, it didn't last, but it was that moment. I realized that absolutely everything that happens to me, or around me, or in the world, is exactly the way it's supposed to be. Now that's a strange realization. And as I say, it didn't stick. And I didn't become aware of it for many, 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 many years later, until many, many years later. Okay. Now, somewhere in the back of my head, I was overwhelmed with, generosity is much too mild a word, but I don't know what else to say. That the generosity of his giving me that love. And the first thing Baba said was, Baba is happy. And I was flattened by the fact that his giving made him happy. And what he gave me, immeasurable, undescribable and everything else, that was, it was just amazing, astounding that somebody would do something like that and then say that made them happy. So he sat me down, and in the old days, I really don't like the lagoon cabin anymore. I think it looks like a motel room with a sofa and this and that and the other. In those days, there was nothing in there. There was just Baba's chair, a little table with a vase of flowers on it, and a bench on the side door, by the side door, and a bench by the front door. That's correct, isn't it, Adele? There was nothing else in there.
Rather can't remember exactly what Baba was on. Sometimes I didn't.
No, he was sitting in a chair. It was a chair when I saw him.
I was in a chair.
No, it was a chair.
I think it was more like.
No, dear. You saw him the day before. I saw him, there was a chair. Gentle though I am. Anyway, so he sat me down on that little bench. And he sat me there, and then we went to the opposite side. And that was the only time I ever saw Baba, when he was in good health. Because, you know, he had the accident immediately after, and ever after that, you know, something was wrong. But I saw Baba. First of all, his hair was down. And Baba was beautiful with his hair braided. But with his hair down, when I tell you something, Baba was beautiful. I mean, you don't know how beautiful he was. And there's no way really that I can tell you how beautiful he was, because nothing and no one is like him. He was unique. And he had his skin, I remembered it sort of honey colored. And it was almost as if there was a light underneath his skin. And beautiful. And he was on the opposite. There was a little window over there. And he was on the opposite wall. And I saw him walk. He strode up and down. And his hands were behind his back, and they were doing this, as they often. But the only thing, you know, there's that movie from Nasik in 1936. And towards the end of the movie where Bob was walking across the field, but you get an idea. Did you notice the other people? They're running. And Baba is walking with that beautiful stride. There was never a stride like that. There was never rhythm like that. And there he was. And he walked up and down for some time. I don't know how long it was. And then there was a little stool. He took a little stool and sat almost knee to knee with me. And he said, I love you more than you will, I don't know, you can know or ever will know, something like that. And ordinarily I would say, oh yeah, but I didn't, because he had embraced me. And, okay. So then he sent me away. And I went wandering off, and I wandered down by the lagoon.
Was there anybody in the room other than
Rano and Delia. And Rano was reading the alphabet board. And she apologized because she couldn't read it very well. Usually one of the men read it. And of course I was amazed at it, you know, the way he did it anyway. And there was a funny thing that, and Delia told this story on herself, that she was crying. I mean, I didn't cry. Oh, and I forgot to tell you that. Well, you wouldn't know how difficult it would be for me to say to someone, I love you. And also to someone, Baba, whom I didn't think I had any feeling for at all. But when he said, I love you more, and I said, I love you too, Baba. And I do not know where that came from. But I do remember it sounded about this big, you know, compared to him, that I said it. And Delia was crying, and Baba looked at her and said, what are you crying about? Anyway, so then he sent me away. And you know, I'm always saying Baba said this and that and the other. And I want to tell you that I never heard Baba's voice, but Baba was never silent to me. I don't think he was silent to anyone. I never heard it. And, you know, whoever was translating, it was like Baba was saying it. And that, but anyway. And I'm wandering off down there, and all of it, I don't know how long I was there, but a rather exasperated Sarosh comes panting up to me, and he said, I have a message for you. And he said, Baba said to tell you that he knows how much you love him. I don't know what to make of that. I didn't care, because I knew it was true, and it didn't matter. And to this day, I don't know how much. You know, how little, how much. But he knows how much, and I'm willing to accept it. And fine, and then he went away. And then I took a new turn, and I decided wandering through the woods. And a little while later, Saros comes panting up again. He said, I have this message for you. And it was the same thing. Baba to tell you he knows how much you love him. Okay, and then he called all of us back into the into the lagoon cabin. And we sat on this bench in the same order. And Baba did a rather odd thing. He didn't say anything, and he stood in front of Zebra for quite some time. And then he just stepped over and he stood in front of Sura. And he stood in front of Skipper and me. And then he sat down on that little stool in front of us and said, I was with you in the plane yesterday. Now, you must take me back with you. Okay. And basically, he sent us away. Now, this was a beautiful day. I mean, a beautiful day at the center. It's early and the sun is shining, and you know, the dew is sparkling and everything like that. And Mr. Bai, our pilot, was waiting for us because he was going to fly us to Bloomington, right? So we could do the performance that evening. Well, what can I tell you? We got into the plane and the clouds came over. And we flew and we flew and we flew and so forth and so on. And what can I tell you? We were grounded in Louisville. And they were ready for us this time. And we couldn't get away. So we were desperate because the time was, you know, that was early in the morning and the performance is at 8 o'clock at night, and yet it was getting close. So I said, we can rent a car because, you know, Louisville is not all that far from. And so we rented a car, and Mr. Bai said, you a good driver? And I said, well, I can drive. And he said, well, I'm a pretty good driver. You want me to drive you? And I said, do you want to do that? And he said, I am paid to get you to drive. So this guy was not only a fabulous driver, he thought he was flying a plane. We went over those country back roads, I mean, in this terrible weather, boom. But he wasn't quite fast enough because we got to the, I don't know, he must have had radar because I don't know whether he knew, I don't remember, but coming into Bloomington, okay, well, we're not in the town square, right? We're in a theater someplace. And, but anyway, he found it, and we got there just in time for the curtain to come down on the second act of Aida. And the second act of Aida has the triumphal scene, which is the big production number with the full company and all of the dancers and this and that and the other. And we had just missed it. And I had an understudy, of course, and each of these girls were principled in that they led on big groups of girls. The company, the dance, there were 36 people, which was a large company. And apparently the performance was chaos because the girls who were understudying them, the girls who were leading off the one group of girls went in the wrong wing and ran into the group that was coming on. And the guy who I partnered the ballerina, and he dropped her. He dropped her from here to there. And the thing is, the music went da 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 da. So it was not a great dance performance. Okay. Well, we run into the backstage, and whom do we run into? Mind you that Mr. Bing was some sort of demigod and didn't hang around in the filthy environs of backstage, but there he was. And I went up to him and I said, Mr. Bing, I'm awfully sorry, you know, but the weather, he was frigid. And he said, you knew this could happen. And I said, well, yes, sir, but you let us go. You know. I was always very diplomatic. But it was true. Well, it turned out that the company had been hysterical because the weather had been so terrible. It was like the worst weather in 20 years. And they didn't know what happened to us, and they hadn't heard from us, and we were not back when we were supposed to be back, and they were just so relieved to see us that we were alive. And 25 years later, I learned that the reason Rano greeted me with that frigidity was because apparently that day when we were in the air, Baba made everybody who was on the center, they made their lives miserable. Now that was the day that he had sent the group of men disciples, and Miss Craske also went with Elizabeth, and Miss Craske had left for the West Coast. They were on their way to Prague, Oklahoma that day. So only a few of them were left. I know Rano and Kitty and Delia and Sarosh, and I don't know who else.
Elizabeth was still there. She
She-
drove Lois.
Oh, okay, that would make sense. Right. Huh? Well, anyway, I don't know. But anyway, he made their lives miserable because oh yes, of course Elizabeth was there because she told me the story that he called her in and he said, Elizabeth, who was an aviatrix, by the way, did you know that?
No.
Yeah, and she was apparently quite an adventurous one. Didn't she fly over the North Pole or something like that? Yeah. Anyway, he called her in and he said, Elizabeth, is this very bad weather for flying? And she said, well, Baba, it can't be any worse. And he said, well, tell me, do you think they've gone down? And she said, well, I don't know, Baba. And he said, you go and you check on the weather report. Well, Elizabeth, being Elizabeth, called Washington. And got this detailed weather analysis, which said that it couldn't be worse, And nothing was in the air but flies and mosquitoes. And he made Kitty, I think, she had to go to the kitchen. He said, go make them something to eat. They'll be hungry when they come. And she made sandwiches. And he sent Sarosh to the airport with these sandwiches. And of course we were not there. And he came back. And he did that 3 times. And they had to throw out the old sandwiches and make new sandwiches. Because fresh sandwiches we would be hungry. So that was why Rano said, you could have sent a telegram. And apparently they were really made quite uncomfortable. But they were sports enough. And also another very sweet thing happened. I deduced 30 years later, at least, 25 years later, came to New York selling books and said she was with Baba that evening when we arrived. And he was staying in the guest house. And he had apparently he tied a handkerchief around his head before he retired at night. I didn't know that, but she said he did. And that she was with him when they were taking a little walk in that little compound. And someone came to him and told him that we had arrived. And he looked at Ivy and said, I wasn't going to work tomorrow, but I cannot resist love. And he patted the pocket that he had our telegram in. So that's the story of how I came to Baba. How long am I supposed to talk?
Another 20 minutes.
Another 20 minutes? Oh. Well, I do have other stories.
Tell me a bonus story.
Huh?
Tell me.
Oh, no. Except the way I talk, I'm so long-winded. What? Oh, the Bible scope? Okay. I'll abbreviate that one because that's pretty, but I'll tell it. So, okay. Well, after that, I was really, as Miss Craske put it, I was quite knocked off my perch. And apparently she told Baba that. She said, Baba, you've knocked that boy right off his perch. Because after we came back, after the tour was over and so forth, and she was still with Baba, and Baba had had the accident, and so forth and so on. And I had I had signed a contract. I went right into rehearsal for another show. I went into a rehearsal for the opening of the Joan Beach Theater on Joan Beach in Long Island. Now that was a job. But anyway, so rehearsal times are not easy at any rate, but all I could think about, and I had a reputation. I was a very disciplined dancer. I was a very quick study, and I was very conscientious, and so forth and so on. And that's true. But boy, all I could think about was Baba. And all I really wanted to do in life, and I was very ambitious. Come on already, I was a dancer. And I wanted fame and fortune, glamour, and admiration. What do you want? And, but I just didn't, all I wanted to be was close to Baba. So we were forbidden to communicate with Baba. But I wasn't forbidden to communicate with Miss Craske. But so I wrote to her daily, and just, I don't know what I said. But it was only later that she told me that her job was to massage Baba's good legs and keep the circulation going and so forth. She's very good. Miss Craske just knew about everything about the human body, and which made her a genius of a teacher. But I did not know that she was with him and intimately with him, though all that time. And I don't know, many, many, many weeks later, she wrote me a little, she never responded to my letter daily. She wrote me a little note. She said, I have a message for you. And to just show you just how really sweet Baba was, he said, tell that boy his messages of love will make me strong again. And so, and along this time, I said, Miss Craske, what am I going to do? I mean, I can't do anything. And she said, well, why don't you make him something? I said, oh, okay. I thought I was fairly manually dexterous. And I thought, and I started, I said, I'll make him a box. And I'll carve him a beautiful box. And I got a gorgeous hunk of walnut, and I started carving, and I had it all designed that there was a lizard on one side and crawling over the top. And I started blocking, and I said, wait a minute. You're not going to use a box. What's he going to do with a box? And Miss Craske said, make him something and give it to him, but be prepared that he'll give it away right away. And I said, and then somebody would say, who the heck gave him this crazy box? So I decided, well, I'll make him something that maybe he won't give away. I'll make him a coat. So, I mean, I can sew. Both my parents, they didn't actually teach me, but I grew up around sewing. My father was a tailor, my mother was a very good sewer. So I made him, and I asked Miss Craske, what size is Baba? Because if you had told me he was 12 feet tall, I said, oh yeah. And if you told me he was 3 feet tall, I would say, sure. Because when I saw Baba, he was, he was everything. He was anything. He could have been, I don't know. I knew he wasn't 12 feet tall, and I knew he wasn't 4 feet tall, but I didn't know how big he was. And she said, he's about your size. Which he was. In those days, I was thin and gracious. And so I made him, I got a beautiful piece of white woolen gabardine, and I made him a very nice little coat with a Nehru collar and, pockets and everything like that, the style I had seen the photographs. And then, lo and behold, we were given the opportunity to see Baba, and I think it was something like exactly 2 months after I had seen him. It was July, wasn't it? Wasn't it July at Agaduce's apartment?
Yes.
Yeah. Hot. Ooh. But anyway, we were given the opportunity to come and see Baba again. So I had this coat, and I went. Mind you, it was lightweight woolen gabardine. But anyway, I just couldn't wait. I was like a junkie. I couldn't wait for another fix from Baba. After that first one, boy, oh boy, let me tell you, it would addict anyone. And so there I went, and I met Miss Craske at the door of his room, and I introduced his apartment, blistering, hot and humid summer day. And you know how beautiful Mama was the first time. And she said, "You're not to ask any questions." Yes, ma'am. And I walked in, and it was almost like somebody slapped me with a cold towel, because what I saw was a man lying on the bed with his leg in a cast and his arm in a cast. His hair was down again, but it was streamy because he was perspiring. He was obviously very, very uncomfortable. He was in pain, the heat was bothering him, and he was sitting on this bed. And I just dropped the coat and let it flop at the end of the bed. And he motioned to me rather dispassionately. And he said, "Sit down." And I sat down on the bed. And Mama was lying here. And I sat down this way on the bed. And he took my hand with his free hand. He took my left hand. And he took it and he pressed, and he looked out the window. And he pressed my hand. Baba's strength, I do not say it hurt, but the power and the strength of his pressing that hand against his chest was noticeable. And I don't know how long that was, but then he gave me a grape, and he picked up a grape, and I held out my hand and said, "No." And I opened my mouth, and he put the grape in, and I had the grape. And he looked at me with such power that I went, And then he said, "Leave." Now, when I bit the grape, he told me to leave. Okay, well, he knocked me from cloud 9 to the 5th basement with that. There I went into all high, and I will say that being on cloud 9 was not all that good. But at the same time, you're not going to make an awful lot of effort to come down. I mean, it wasn't easy to live in the world and rehearse with all that junky choreography and everything. But there was this kind of, euphoria about it and everything. And so he knocked me into the basement. And whereas it may have not have been perfectly comfortable on cloud 9, you're going to crawl your way out of the basement. You're not going to stay down there. So forever after, this is only in my own mind, which is not the best, by the way, that I was always grateful to him for doing that to me, because it gave me some kind of balance with him, I thought. Because every time I saw Baba, I saw him in an entirely different way. And yet I knew my friends very well, even though, do you know that those girls and I never discussed amongst ourselves what had happened with Baba? We never talked about it to this day. And now it happened and we're gone. And I don't even know what their reaction to Baba was. But anyway, I know Zebra. She saw him again, and she was exactly the same. She was in tears for 3 days. And Sura was the same, and Skipper was the same. And yet I saw him in a very different light. And I can't tell you how or what. It certainly wasn't in a case of enlightenment or anything like that, but I saw him differently. And very startlingly differently in 1962, when all the times, 52, 54, 56, and 58, it had been intensely personal, very, very personal with Baba, between him and me. And when I saw him in 1962, the Western men saw him in the morning, and boy, it was totally impersonal. This was business. Whatever Baba's job was, we just happened to be there as, hired hands. And it was totally impersonal. And I saw Baba in a strange way in 1962 because,
10 minutes. 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. I didn't get started on time, But anyway.
15 minutes.
Okay, I'll cut that part, and I'll go back to the code. big rain in '62. We all went in, and the sun was beating down mercilessly and everything, and we got in there, and that very first day, and this it's incredible. Cloudburst happened, and pandemonium broke loose. I don't know, sort of very strange atmosphere to me. I mean, thunderously powerful, strong, and I would say almost ominous. To me, it was ominous. And people had, suddenly they broke all the rules, and they were afraid they were not going to see Baba. And this mass of people rushed towards the dais. And I don't know what happened. Men, of course, the Indian men who were Zingo, they were they were ready, they formed a chain around Baba. A patent tank couldn't have gotten through them to Baba. But then the men, the Western men and the Indian men formed chains on the aisle. Anyway, okay, we'll go back to the code. So, after a few days after I met Baba, and he had sent me down to the basement and so forth and so on, very early in the morning, like 6:30 in the morning, which is midnight to me, the phone rang, and this strange voice, which happened to be Miss Craske. I knew her very well, but this voice I'd never heard before, and she said, "I have a message for you from Baba." And my blood ran cold the way she said it. I don't know why, but anyway, she said, "Baba said to tell that boy that when Baba needs a new coat, he is to make it." No, I forgot the part. He said, "Tell that boy he's put his head into a noose." That's what it was. Now, mind you, I have no idea what that means. And that didn't frighten me or anything like that, because I didn't know what it meant. Could be a noose of love, couldn't it?
Yes, yes, yes.
Just a minute. It could also be a noose that you can hang yourself with. Couldn't it? Yeah, it could. Okay. And then he said, when Baba needs a new coat, he is to make it, but he is not to work on it until I tell him to. Okay. So years pass, and 1956 comes along. And 1956, in 1952, I had made Baba a disastrous pair of sandals. Disastrous. But anyway, so I said, I'm going to put that right. I'm going to make him another pair of sandals. So I started him a pair of evening sandals on black suede with cutout and gold embroidery and red leather underneath. So the red came through the gold and the black. Now, can't you see Baba? And they were thong sandals besides. I never saw him, but I don't know, maybe he wore them, between the toe and So I started those sandals, and I hadn't finished them. And we got down to Myrtle Beach. I have to abbreviate this because they're going to throw me out. They're going to get me. Anyway, and we get down to Myrtle Beach, and of course, don't ask me what we did, but we never had any time. We never had any time. We were waiting to see Baba, and Baba would send for you, and you had to be there. Zip, zip! You had to be there in no time flat. And yet, I had to finish these sandals. I was not going to give him these sandals, so I would go to the original. I was staying in the far cabin, and with Donald Stevens and Peter Saul. And that's when Donald Stevens tried to get me to read God Speaks every morning. That's when they start the morning. But it didn't work. So I would go to the original kitchen, and I would work on the sandals at night, And stupid me, I used glue, and when you use the glue, you hammer the glue to hammer out all the bubbles. And I had a tiny little toy hammer, literally a toy, a child's toy, hammer about this long, and I would tap, tap, tap. And it never occurred to me, boy, bright that I am, that sound carries over water. Well, everybody knew I was making these sandals, and I met Leatrice's mother in the path. One morning she said, "We heard the fairy cobbler last night." But anyway, okay, comes the day, and early one morning, somebody comes knocking on the far cabin and said, "Baba wants to see you." And so I threw on some clothes and I went there. It was very early, and the center was absolutely ravishingly beautiful, and golden with, the flowers were like the songs of the bird. They were just so vibrant. And anyway, Baba was sitting on this little railing that went around the center, and upon which we were forbidden to sit, because that's where the Chiggers lived. But anyway, Baba was sitting there, and he said, sit down, Tex. He said, sit down, Tex. So I sat down next to Baba, and he said to me, isn't this beautiful, Tex? And I said, oh, Baba, it really is. And he said, look at that. And he pointed to a sort of a frame where the trees and vegetation, and there was a little knoll. And that little knoll is where the farm shed is now built. But it was across the lagoon, and he said, isn't that beautiful? I said, oh, yes. And he said, make the coat. And I nearly fell over that. And I said, and this is the case where I said, oh, I'm not to finish the sandals? The minute I said that, I said, you shouldn't have said that. And boy, I wish I hadn't. But anyway, he said, what sandals? And I said, well, you know what I thought. And he said, And he looked very serious. And he said, okay, finish them. Well, by this time I had discarded the idea of evening slippers. And I was making a pair of practical sandals. Well, I will abbreviate all of this. But he said at that time, they had to be ready by Wednesday. It was now Sunday, maybe. And so, okay. And that's when I really stayed up all night and so forth and so on. And I made them, and I finished them, and I knew they were not right. But I finished them. They had to be ready by Wednesday, and there was no that's right. And I tucked them in my back pocket, in a bag, round paper bag. Well, come Wednesday, he doesn't say a word. Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, he ignores them completely. And then we go to the Brook Green Gardens, whatever day that was, and we go over there, and we're wandering around the place, and there's this huge crowd of people, and who was talking about people, how they managed to get to Siva? I'll tell you how they managed. It was called elbows. And I'm going to tell you that Billy Eden has the sharpest elbow ever in America, because I had been knocked flat. So I gave that up. I said, this is nonsense. I'm going to stay on the fringes. And Peter and I were always on the fringes. People were rushing around. And I never knew what was going on in the front. Never. I didn't care, frankly. And we were with Baba. And all of a sudden, everybody stops. It was like dominoes. We all smash into one another. And there for some time, and we're wondering what's happening. And all of a sudden, the crowd parts, and all these heads turn. And Baba's sitting under a tree, and he looked at me and he said, come here. And I came and he said, give me the sandals. And I had them in my back pocket. And I gave them to him, and another disaster. They did not fit. That was the one kind thing the Sufis did to me. It was in a movie, and he was trying to walk with them, but they cut it out. He couldn't walk in them. And so, okay, so then I'm free to make the coat, right? But I didn't have scissors, I didn't have fabric, and we were down in Myrtle Beach, and we were forbidden to leave the center. So I had to go to Baba, and I did not like this. I said, Baba, I asked to see him, and I was given permission. I said, may I go into town, and buy some fabric to make your coat? And he, very, very serious. This didn't bode any good. He said, okay, go ahead. Well, I went into Myrtle Beach. And, of course, they had beautiful cottons. I will say that. But I didn't want to make a coat by hand with cotton. I never saw him in a cotton coat. But I bought a beautiful piece of cotton, blue cotton. And I bought scissors, and I bought thread, and so forth and so on, all pins and all the things I would need. And then but I never cut the cotton, because I didn't want to make it out of cotton. I don't know why. And then suddenly we leave Myrtle Beach, we go to Washington, we go from Washington to Los Angeles, from Los Angeles to Ojai and back, and there's no time for anything. And then we go to San Francisco. The day we had arrived in San Francisco, I don't care if I do run over time. I'm going to tell you a story. That the night before we went to San Francisco, I had a terrible night because we were in the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel. I think Bob was on the 7th floor, was he? Anyway, I was 2 floors below, whatever it was. And Petersall was in that bed, and I was in it, and there was an area in between. And that night, I was in that dreadful state that I'm sure we all experience, where you're not asleep and you're not awake. And the reason I was because Baba was walking up and down beside my bed. Now, mind you, I didn't see him. It was not a physical presence, but it was like, in this state of stupor. He was walking up and pacing up and down, pacing up and down. And then, of course, we were supposed to be ready at 7 o'clock. And at 6 o'clock, bang, bang, bang on the door. Where are you? Baba's ready. He was always doing that. And he would say, well, it's 7 o'clock my time. And so anyway, and we all gathered down. We were going to go to San Francisco, and we went down to the lobby of the hotel, and we were waiting for transportation, and Baba looked at me very, very casually, and he said, did you sleep well? And I said, and stupidly, you're not going to complain to Baba about not sleeping in front of people. So I said, oh, I'm fine, Baba. He ignored it. And then we got to the airport. All this chaos, and it went very smoothly, but still there were a lot of people, and there was schmiggy there. And a big fuffle. And we get to the airport, and we're waiting for the plane. And again, I happened to be close to Bob, and very casually he looked at me and he said, you slept well? And I said, oh, yes, Bob, I slept fine. Okay. So we get into the air. And we're in the air, and Bunty and I are sitting in the bulkhead seats, and Baba is several rows behind. And I think it was Adi, Baba, and Meherji in the 3 seats. And all of a sudden, Adi comes up to the front, and he said, Baba wants to see you. And I didn't like the tone of voice. So I went back, and then Baba was not casual at all. He looked me straight in the eye, and he said, how did you sleep? And I said, well, actually, Baba, I didn't sleep at all. And Baba beamed, and he reached across, took me under the arm, and lifted me right across Adi, and gave me this enormous embrace, and sent me away. Now, don't ask me what that was about, but if you get an embrace, don't worry about it. And I went up, and I was sitting there, and Bunty said, what was that all about? And I said, well, I really don't know, and so I started telling her, she sort of got a funny look on her face, and I started to turn my head, and this hand came and pushed my head back into that, again, and I knew it was Baba then. I struggled for a second, and then I realized it was Baba and stopped. And I realized with that kind of strength that that was Baba. And he pushed my head back into the seat. First, I don't know how long. And then he went away, and I said to her, I was stunned. And I said to Bunty, what did he do? And she said, he didn't do anything, he just looked straight ahead. Oh. So that was another strange thing that happened. With Baba. Okay, then we get to San Francisco, and we get there, and Baba says, take the afternoon off. You can go into the city, you can do that. Aha! And I went, and I asked somebody, I said, where's the best fabric store? And they told me, and I went, and I got this beautiful, glorious English flannel. A lightweight, it was like a cloud. And the most beautiful sky blue you ever saw. I don't know why I insisted Baba had to be blue. He looked wonderful. So anyway, I made this, and I stayed up. And then, of course, he never gave you a chance. He never gave you any time. Believe me, there was never any time. And I remember distinctly that I am not a beach baby, and I don't give a damn about the water or swimming or the sun or anything like that. But we were having lunch, and I thought, oh boy, this afternoon I'm going to be able to work on that coat. And then he said, Baba came in and said, you enjoying lunch? And I said, yes, yes. And he said, go to the pool and enjoy yourselves. Well, that happens to be in order. I had to go to the pool. And this coat is up there. And mind you, I bought silk thread, And it's because I wanted it strong and beautiful. And silk thread is very beautiful, but nothing knots like silk thread. And I was back stitching this whole coat with a flat fell seam. And those of you who do not know what a flat fell seam is, you stitch it 3 times. And anyway, I made this coat and I stayed up for 5 nights in a row. And again, I had to make a request. We were going to go to the Lilliput Theater to see puppets with Baba. And I didn't want to do it, but I asked to see him, and I said, Baba, may I have permission to stay at home and work on the coat? And he looked at me and he said, you don't want to go to the theater with me? You know that ain't. I said, well, yes, Baba. And they said, all right, stay and work on the coat. Well, I worked on the coat, and I worked on the coat. And again, Jean Shaw comes into the picture because I was sitting with, the dancers were sitting with Kitty, because Kitty saved all the fruit. When Baba met people, I think it was somebody who lived in San Francisco, would provide these beautiful fruits and flowers. And anyway, she would save all the fruit, and the dancer would sneak in after the interviews, and we would eat all the fruit. So we were there in that little compound. There were these little stakes. Each room had these sort of pails dividing them. And I'm talking, at that time, I had to take some breaks. And I said, you know, I don't know, I'm ready to put the hem in the sleeve, but I don't know how long they are. And I hear this voice, and I know. And I turned around, it's Jean Shaw. And I said, oh, you know how long? And I said, how do you know? And she said, well, I do the ironing. Adele did the washing, and she did the ironing. And I said, oh, okay. So I'm terribly impressed, right? So I said, okay, so how long is it? And she took the garment on the arm, and it was just there. And I thought to myself, sure. Well, I put a pin there, okay? I said, well, you don't know how long it is. She said, well, her guess is as good as mine. So I made, what can I do? It was perfect, exact, right there. But anyway, Baba then started, embarrassing me in public by saying, oh, have you finished the coat? Mind you, he hadn't given me 1 minute to work on it. And it got to be a running joke. That no, Tex has not finished the coat. And Baba said, I know when I'm flying away, you'll be running around. Well, that's just about the way it happened, because he was leaving the next morning, and I had not finished that coat. And, I mean, there's an awful lot of stitching. And so I stayed up. I didn't go to sleep to bed. And but I didn't have time to put pockets on. I had it finished, but there were no pockets. And I had to ask Baba permission. I said, Baba, when I finish, I'll be able to finish the coat. We were not permitted to go near Baba's room when he retired. So I said, may I just drop it on your doorstep? And again, he went through that thing of looking very, and he said, okay, put it there. So I finished it like 5 o'clock in the morning, and I tipped on it, and I dropped it. And I leave it in front of Baba's doorstep. And I get back to the room, and I'm absolutely cross-eyed and bleary-eyed. And I think my head hit the pillow, and there was a knock on the door. And it was 6 o'clock, and said, Baba wants to see you. So I threw on some clothes, and I went charging around, and I just rounded the corner, and Baba's room, the door was open. And Baba was standing at the other side, and I just turned, and I hit, and he was framed in the doorway, and he was standing there in that coat. Oh. And he said, don't I look handsome? And I must say he really did. I say without humility or anything else that coat looked gorgeous on him. And he wore that coat when he left Los Angeles. And again, the Sufis did me a favor, because they were filming all of that. And there was I saw it once, there was a shot of him at the airport, and he's going like this. Oh, you've seen it? But anyway, okay. But then I never thought anything about it, and then 20 years later, there was a film from Australia, and a rather, not a very good film, actually. But like in the, there's this shot of the plane and it comes in, the door open, and so forth and so on, and Baba stepped out of the plane in that coat. Of course, he had it on when he lived in San Francisco. He had it on in Australia. So that's the story of the coat, and I'm not so terribly late.
Yeah.